Hello everyone, welcome to another mini lecture for English 2090. So today we're going to discuss a lot of important compositional elements focusing on rule of thirds, composition theory, and the quadrant system. In particular, we're going to focus on how people use angles to create that kind of mise-en-scé idea. So we're going to look at a couple of kind of foundational ways that you could establish a frame and a sequence and so on. The rule of thirds is probably something that most of you are familiar with. If you aren't, anytime you use your phone to take a picture, you'll see this grid. That's what it is. It's the fundamental principle of photography and cinematography. Most, not all, but most people use it to create a frame. The guideline proposes that an image should be imagined as divided into 9 equal parts by 2 equally spaced horizontal and 2 equally spaced vertical. What happens is that all important compositional elements should be placed along these lines and their intersections. So we just have I pulled a couple of different random frames from the movies. This one is from Bloodlust. This was the kind of teenage adaptation of The Most Dangerous Game. So, we have all our principal main characters, right? Notice how things are not quite centered, like in a way that one of our kind of secondary characters, right, is actually centered. And the male characters are kind of, divided between the female characters kind of in between the male characters. So what we're doing here is just setting up, a simple shot of all of our principal characters, getting their reactions to the revelation that they're in this kind of terrible hunting game. And the way we do it is just, again, we don't have everyone centered, we have one of our main actresses centered to see her reaction, but we equally get good kind of positioning, and we have that bear, right? Again, mise-en-scé, right? It's constantly threats. We have like the boar's head here, and so what we're doing is we're showing that these kids are in danger, right? Even when we're not directly stating it. So we could see not only their reactions, but the surrounding kind of elements too, placed not in center, but just kind of surrounding them. Notice how they're surrounding all the characters. It's just a way to kind of create a more visually pleasing shot, but also to kind of get a lot of detail in, right? Just very quickly. And again, it's just a very simple thing. And when we see the kind of horizontal lines, we see, okay, there's a lot going on here. So turkey shoot, same thing. This is a kind of a very interesting way of doing that kind of rule of thirds when you have 3 characters. Notice how, again, our not so important character, right, is in center, right? Which in a way goes against a lot of kind of ideas, right? You would think you would want to put your main characters always dead center. But in this case, we're able to see a side character's reactions to the main characters talking. And we frame it this way to obviously have them kind of on equal plane, right? Notice how they're kind of, in a way, they kind of equalized, right, with our horizontal lines. But again, it's just a way to kind of get good dynamic movement from a dialogue scene, right? The scene is not very complex, it's just dialogue, but we get, and the framing gets actors to kind of show their reactions. We as audience can see their reactions at the same time, back and forth. And it creates this kind of almost like a tennis game where we're kind of looking at his reactions, we're looking at her reactions, but we're also kind of cognizant of her, even though she's in the background. So it's just a way to create kind of interesting shots, right? Another one from The Raven that will come up if you choose to watch this one. Again, this is kind of like a classic rule of thirds. When we do our kind of vertical lines, we see our main character Craven with the raven in the shot. And, what's centered is actually almost like blank space. And again, it's just a way to kind of create a more dynamic shot than if we just always had our subjects positioned dead center. And so it's just a way to kind of, create very kind of static shots in a way that's still very pleasing to the eye, right? And so again, it's just kind of an interesting kind of idea and approach to help. Other ways that you could kind of work around the kind of rule of third, but also to still, sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't, is the compositional theory of static and dynamic composition. So static composition means that the majority of lines on the page are going to be horizontal or vertical. The theory asserts that horizontal and vertical lines have a soothing, calm, tranquil effect on the observer. So this is a good example, again, from Bloodlust, where we just get a very static composition. Our actors are very, vertically positioned. We have, even though, again, there's like a minor diagonal line with the railing, it's not a dominant, right? It's a very just static, right? Look at like both of their hands, right? Again, it's a very practical way, but it creates a very just kind of static shot, very tranquil, right? Before, of course, the danger happens on the island. And so again, you'll see a lot, even with the water, again, being very calm. Like you'll see a lot of, again, mise-en-scé, the visual element of very calming, right? Soothing before the horror occurs, right? Before the action occurs. So a lot of times, photographers, cinematographers will play around with dynamic and static. So dynamic is when you use many diagonal lines. Diagonals are somewhat unsettling, which can result in a sense of movement, energy, or excitement that generates from a dynamic composition. They can also help with a claustrophobic feeling or disorientation. A lot of times if a character's drunk, the camera will be what we call at a Dutch angle. So, either if it's a POV shot or if it is just on the character itself, things are just kind of odd, right? Because they're kind of twisted. This is a good example of the dynamic composition here. Obviously, this is an action sequence, but when we remove the kind of still frames from this scene, we could see, okay, yeah, notice how it's positioned on the table. The table could be, vertical, but it's diagonal, right? To create the kind of tension, the fear, and things like that. So what we do here, and again, you could normally just shoot the kind of, execution table, I guess, like very straight, right? How a bed would normally be. But once we just twist it a bit with the angle, right? We just kind of create that kind of tension, right? And this is what we do when we're doing dynamic composition. And again, notice all the elements that are diagonal, right? So the dominant diagonal kind of lines will create that tension for us as well. And again, interesting theory. But again, you can see all the different lines. So another element that you could use the camera to further kind of help is what we had called high angle and low angle. So high angle shots are when the camera looks down on the subject from a high angle, and the point of focus often gets kind of swallowed up. High angle shots can make the subject seem vulnerable or powerless when applied with the correct mood, setting, and effects. Oh, so before I move on. So again, just this shot where, our character Craving is learning what's happening about this world and then the kind of conflict that he's going to be thrown into. And so we get this kind of high angle to show his kind of lack of understanding, his uncertainty, his diffidence, right? Because he's a very diffident character. He lacks self-confidence in the early part of the movie. So what we do is we also have him in high angle shots a lot to kind of create that kind of, weakness of the character in the beginning. And so again, it's just an interesting way to play around it. The opposite, of course, is low angle, and you can see here, right? Our very menacing guard, we shoot from below to make him even more menacing. So a shot from a camera angle positioned low on the vertical axis, anywhere below the eye line looking up. Sometimes it's even directly below the subject's feet, right, to create even more of a sense of terror or power or dominance. Psychologically, the effect of the low angle shot is that it makes the subject look strong and powerful, and that's the whole purpose of this, frame here. It's like, okay, we're gonna do a, low angle shot for a while because we're trying to make him as menacing and terrifying as possible. And again, it's something that you see in all sorts of films. It even is a specific name where it has assassination shot or trunk shots. So in Ghost Dog and Reservoir Dogs, the assassination shot, and this is true for everything. You could look at Punisher, you could look at, I'm trying to think of like any kind of like mainstream gangster movie, but like Godfather, anything that has assassinations and all that, they use that low angle all the time for the point of view of the victim to create that terrifyingness, right? For that last moment, right? This is the last thing you see, which is terrifying for the character, but also, vicariously for the audience. So again, it's a very common term. So I put this video on, but I do want to explain it just a little bit further as well, and you can watch the video on your own. But the quadrant system is even a further fundamental composition principle that most photographers and cinematographers use to create a sense of rivalry or competition of dominance during a shot or scene. Whether used in photography or film, the quadrant system usually establishes two narratives occurring simultaneously. It usually portrays one subject as dominant and one as subservient, right, which applies to people or objects in the frame, right, still composite. So we could take a look at one of our kind of elements here is the sense of rivalry, right? We have the wizard battle from one of the Raven. And again, when you look at it, it's a very, when we look at the vertical element, right, we see that specific kind of opposition, right, the rivalry. So it's just done in a way to frame the kind of positioning. And if you see, right, when we actually separate into 4 instead of 9, when we just focus on the quadrants, instead of the rule of thirds, we see a very interesting kind of dynamic here, right? Where we have the hands in the kind of, get back there. When the hands within the same position, right? Frame left, frame right, and so we're just kind of seeing, right? And then the fire too, notice how the fire is in both quadrants. So it's just adding a sense of drama, right? Instead of using the rule of thirds, we could use the quadrant system as well to, again, create a sense of mise-en-scé, to create a sense of rivalry and so forth. And again, if we just look at, the top bottom, right, you see that kind of interesting dynamic there where the floor is rubble, right, and then the top part of the frame is on fire. So it's just an interesting way of kind of creating contrast, juxtaposition of our characters. Notice too, when we do this, right, the evil character has, these evil statues, right, in the background, whereas our hero just has the fire and the rubble, right? So earth, right? So he's more of a natural hero, and then the villain is unnatural, right? It's very typical kind of mise-en-scé kind of elements at times with creating those visual metaphors for characters. So again, if you have questions, always kind of, okay, just realized that information was outdated. So you're seeing me adjust this in real time. But obviously, if you have questions, email. If you need it in alternative formats, please contact ARC in the Oxidine building. Again, if not, just enjoy the rest of the week and take care.